I never expected the storm that would follow after putting distance between myself and my family, but here I am, nearing 30, with the past catching up in ways I didn't foresee. Growing up, my fraternal twin sister and I didn't have it easy. Our parents had us later in life after years of fertility treatments. They were convinced I'd be a boy, but when I wasn't, their disappointment was palpable. What followed was a childhood overshadowed by neglect, emotional manipulation, and financial abuse. To call my parents toxic feels like an understatement. They completely wrecked my early years. At 18, I finally escaped that nightmare. When I asked for basic documents like my ID and social security card, they mailed them to me alongside a cease and desist letter, as if to hammer home that I was no longer part of the family. That was the last time I heard from them, or so I thought. Years later, my estranged twin sister resurfaced, somehow tracking me down despite the name change I made when I turned 21. She emailed my work account, a boundary she shouldn't even have known existed. The message was filled with guilt-laden cliches about how twins should stay close, and a passive-aggressive mention of inviting the family to my wedding. It left me rattled. How had she even found me? Her mental state became a growing concern. Back in our childhood, she thrived as the golden child, making my life a living hell. She'd stash her things in my room and accuse me of stealing, prompting punishments from our father. These weren't small punishments either. Sometimes I was locked in the basement for days, only allowed out for school or meals. Other times, the abuse turned physical. The worst incident was when I was 17. She shoved me down the basement stairs. I ended up with a broken arm, a concussion, and stitches. My parents forced me to lie, claiming I fell, so she wouldn't face any consequences. 2 months after high school graduation, I was gone, thanks to my friends. For years, things stayed quiet. That peace shattered when my sister-in-law, Lisa, wrote a blog post about my estranged family. Encouraged by her readers, Lisa took it upon herself to play mediator, which only emboldened my twin. The emails escalated into harassing phone calls and threats. I tried to obtain a restraining order, but a cease and desist seemed like a faster solution at the time. It worked briefly, then it didn't. The breaking point came during a family dinner with my in-laws. Lisa, in a misguided attempt at reconciliation, announced that she had brought my twin sister to surprise me. I was paralyzed with panic. My husband quickly called the police while my mother-in-law, who had worked with domestic violence survivors, stepped in to defuse the situation. The police escorted my sister straight to the airport and onto a plane. Meanwhile, Lisa defended her actions, insisting my sister would never harm me. Her betrayal was a gut punch. After everything I'd done to support her, her actions cut deeply. Lisa was promptly ostracized from the family, and my husband made it clear that any apology she offered would be on my terms, if I ever wanted to hear it. I spoke with my therapist and decided against writing Lisa a letter, fearing she'd use it as blog material. Instead, I sent her a cease and desist order, cutting her out of my life entirely. Meanwhile, restraining orders against my parents and sister were finally approved, but my twins' relentless attempts to contact me continued. I was determined to stay firm this time. A few therapy sessions later, armed with new anxiety medication and perspective, I sat down with my in-laws and husband to sort through the chaos. 3 weeks had passed, and I realized it was okay to take my time processing everything. My therapist encouraged me to focus on my healing instead of placating others. With her guidance, I chose to cut contact with Lisa for at least 6 months. My mother-in-law supported the decision, explaining to the family that Lisa's actions couldn't go without consequences. However, my husband's middle brother, who was close to Lisa, didn't take it well. He texted me, calling the decision over the top and complaining it would disrupt the holidays for everyone. My husband was livid. He sent a group message to the family, announcing we wouldn't host the holidays that year. Citing COVID as a convenient reason, he suggested everyone take a break. I agreed wholeheartedly. My anxiety was at an all-time high, and I couldn't handle the emotional toll of hosting. Predictably, someone tried to intervene. My husband's grandparents, who had always doted on Lisa, showed up unannounced. To make matters worse, or maybe better, my husband answered the door completely naked, beer in hand. Mortified, they stormed off, accusing us of tearing the family apart. That sealed the deal for us. No more holidays with them. I sent a message explaining that I was finally prioritizing my well-being instead of playing the forgiving doormat they'd come to expect. Lisa's actions had consequences, and I wasn't backing down. At the time, I was working as a midwife, primarily handling telehealth appointments due to the ongoing pandemic. One of my patients was approaching a critical stage in her pregnancy, so I'd been self-isolating to stay COVID-free before returning to the clinic in person. But a few days ago, something completely unexpected happened. My husband's grandparents showed up at my clinic, dragging Lisa along with them. Even though the clinic was closed, they spent a full 10 minutes pounding on the door before one of the nurses came out, recording the scene on her phone for security purposes. The clinic had signs clearly stating that audio and video surveillance was in use, all perfectly legal. The nurse, maintaining her professionalism, informed them that the clinic was closed and suggested they head to the hospital if they were dealing with an actual medical emergency. But of course, they weren't there for a medical reason. They were there for me. When their demands to see me went unanswered, they actually called the police. The nurse, recognizing this as nonsense, promptly contacted the non-emergency line to report the situation. When officers arrived, my grandparents-in-law explained they were there so Lisa could apologize to me. The police were unimpressed and issued a formal trespassing warning before sending them on their way. When my husband found out, he was furious. He immediately called his grandparents, his voice barely below a shout as he let them have it. Their excuse? Lisa needed to apologize so that we could reunite as a family. I took the phone and firmly reminded them that whether or not I chose to see Lisa again was entirely my decision. My husband, fed up, decided it was time to block his grandparents and Lisa from our phones, vowing to protect our peace. That day, we made a pact to focus on ourselves for the next year. My husband carried a sense of guilt over his grandparents' actions, even though it wasn't his fault. Meanwhile, we were still dealing with the fallout from my parents and twin sister. The restraining orders had been served, and my parents, surprisingly, had stayed quiet so far. My twin, however, was another story. She had taken to calling anyone who would listen, spreading wild rumors that my husband was abusing me. Her detachment from reality had always been evident, but this was a new low. This morning brought yet another unwelcome interruption. Police officers knocking at my door. Despite the restraining orders, my grandfather had filed a welfare check, claiming that my husband was abusing me, keeping me locked inside, and verbally degrading me every day. The officers quickly made it clear they doubted the claims, especially since the evidence came from my estranged twin, who wasn't even supposed to be involved. We invited the officers inside without hesitation. They toured our home, met our happy dogs and playful ducklings, and by the time they left, they were fully convinced everything was fine. They even filed a report countering my grandfather's false claims and assured us that no further welfare checks would be conducted on the basis of such blatantly fabricated accusations. Our lawyers swiftly sent a cease and desist letter to my grandfather, warning him of severe legal consequences for any further harassment. We also forwarded the latest deranged text from my twin to the attorney. In her message, she had concocted an elaborate story about my husband holding me hostage and abusing me. She described me as malnourished, bruised, filthy, and covered in injuries, including a black eye and scratches on my arms. Every word was a lie, but it was painfully clear her grasp on reality was deteriorating. Later that day, my aunt, the same one who had helped me escape my family years ago, sent me screenshots of more outlandish messages from my twin. In these messages, she doubled down on her claims that I was being held against my will and pleaded for someone to rescue me. It was exhausting, but not surprising. I forwarded everything to our lawyer, who agreed that her lies were spiraling dangerously out of control. The situation was escalating, and it was clear we had to stay vigilant. A few days later, things took an even darker and more chaotic turn. While the restraining orders had officially been served to my biological parents and twin, the reactions couldn't have been more different. My parents, as expected, stayed silent, but my twin? She went completely off the rails. Her campaign of lies intensified as she began reaching out to anyone who would listen, claiming I was in immediate danger. The story she spun had become even more elaborate. My husband was supposedly holding me hostage, abusing me, and refusing to let me leave. She claimed the police couldn't intervene because of the restraining order and cast herself as the would-be savior in a dramatic rescue mission. If that wasn't bad enough, my husband's grandparents decided to side with her. Without warning, they escalated the situation. One evening, they showed up at my workplace, dragging my twin along with them. I was stunned. It was after hours, and the clinic was closed. Instead of leaving quietly, they caused a scene, pounding on the doors and shouting to be let in. They demanded to see me as if they had some right to my time or space. One of the nurses, tired of their behavior, called the police. When the officers arrived, my grandparents-in-law and twin tried to downplay the situation, claiming they were just concerned family members trying to reconnect, as if that justified their harassment. The police didn't buy it. They escorted them off the property and issued a formal trespassing warning. For my husband and me, this was the final straw. We were done. My husband blocked his grandparents and anyone else toxic from our phones, and we decided to cut ties completely with those who insisted on dragging us into their mess. Meanwhile, our attorney continued gathering evidence. My twin's increasingly unhinged behavior and lies were building a solid case against her, though it was clear the road ahead would be legally and emotionally draining. The weight of it all was suffocating. Between the constant harassment from my biological family and the relentless interference from my husband's relatives, I felt utterly depleted. Therapy, which I'd already increased to 3 sessions a week, wasn't enough to offset the stress. I was running on empty, both mentally and physically, and it felt like there was no end in sight. As if things couldn't possibly worsen, I woke up to yet another nightmare. My grandfather had filed a welfare check on me, claiming my husband was physically abusive and keeping me locked inside the house against my will. The police arrived, but it was immediately clear they doubted the story. After all, their so-called evidence came from my estranged twin, who was legally barred from contact. We welcomed the officers inside, and they quickly saw through the lies. Our happy, playful dogs and the sight of our ducklings convinced them everything was fine. Before they left, they filed a report to counter my grandfather's accusations and assured us there would be no more welfare checks based on such baseless claims. Our lawyer acted swiftly, sending a cease and desist letter to my grandfather that warned of severe legal consequences for further harassment. At the same time, we provided him with the latest text from my twin, another deranged message accusing my husband of unspeakable things. She'd concocted a vivid story about me being malnourished, bruised, and filthy, complete with a black eye and scratches on my arms. None of it was true, but her descent into delusion was more evident than ever. Later, my aunt, the same one who had helped me escape all those years ago, sent me screenshots of even more lies my twin was spreading. She was messaging anyone who'd listen, claiming she feared for my life and begging someone to intervene. It was horrifying to read, but by now it was almost expected. I forwarded everything to our lawyer, knowing these unhinged messages were critical pieces of evidence for the inevitable legal battle. Then, the situation took a strange turn. My twin had a complete breakdown and was admitted to a specialized clinic after making threats serious enough to warrant intervention. It was obvious her mental state was deteriorating rapidly, but that wasn't even the most shocking part. My biological parents, ever the opportunists, seized the chance to rewrite history. They suddenly pinned all the blame for my abusive childhood on my twin. According to them, she had been solely responsible for everything I'd endured, while they painted themselves as helpless victims of her behavior. It was a blatant, disgusting attempt to absolve themselves of accountability. The audacity was infuriating. They were willing to throw their own daughter under the bus just to protect their image. Seeing them twist the narrative so brazenly was sickening, but I knew I couldn't let their lies derail my healing. No matter how much they tried to rewrite the past, I was determined to stay focused on my future and rebuild my life, free from their toxicity. It didn't take long to realize the situation with my twin was far worse than I could have imagined. Her admission to the clinic wasn't just due to a breakdown. There was a much darker truth behind it. My biological parents had been abusing her for days. They deprived her of food and water, woke her up at all hours to scream at her, and even resorted to physical violence. When she tried to leave, they forcibly stopped her. Eventually, she managed to escape to an urgent care facility, where everything unraveled. Her breakdown there led to her being hospitalized, and it was the medical staff, along with her doctor, who finally stepped in. They reported the abuse to the authorities, and the police got involved. It was a horrifying revelation. For years, I had believed I was the sole target of my parents' cruelty, but now it was clear that they were just as capable of inflicting that same torment on my twin. It was sickening. I later learned that charges were being filed against them, with the possibility of serious jail time. While that news brought a small sense of relief, I knew better than to let my guard down. The legal process was just beginning, and anything could still happen. Amid this chaos, my husband and I made a life-changing decision. We weren't just moving to a different state, we were leaving the country entirely. It was time to put distance, both literal and emotional, between us and the toxicity. We kept our plans to ourselves, quietly preparing, packing, and then slipping away without a word to anyone. When we finally arrived in our new home country, the sense of peace that washed over me was indescribable. We stayed with a friend during our quarantine period, all our animals safely with us, healthy, happy, and settled. My husband had already begun reconnecting with old friends in the area, and I could see the weight of stress that had been crushing him for years starting to lift. Back home, however, the drama wasn't entirely over. My husband's family, particularly his grandparents, were outraged when they discovered we had left without telling them. They accused us of abandoning the family and claimed we had run off to start our own family without including them. For the first time in years, I didn't care what they thought. We were finally prioritizing ourselves, and I refused to let their guilt-tripping affect me. As we settled into our new life, the chaos we had left behind began to unravel further. My biological parents were imploding. My father had reached his breaking point. He took back his old job, moved in with a friend, and completely cut ties with my mother. Their marriage had been crumbling for years, but it wasn't the abuse or neglect that finally drove him away. No, it was her using my name to open fraudulent credit accounts. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all the beatings, lies, and manipulation, it was financial fraud that pushed him over the edge. My mother didn't take it well. In a fit of rage, she physically attacked my father, attempting to claw his eyes out. She was arrested for assault, and when the police arrived, she turned her anger on them too. Now, she's not only facing assault charges, but is also awaiting a psychiatric evaluation. It's safe to say she won't be walking free anytime soon. Meanwhile, another surprising twist emerged. My grandfather, who had once sided with my parents, changed his stance entirely. After seeing how deeply rooted their lies and manipulation were, he kicked them both out of his home. If that wasn't shocking enough, he also rewrote his will, cutting them out completely and leaving everything to my aunt, the same aunt who had helped me escape years ago. For the first time, I felt like I might finally be free. My parents were tearing each other apart. My twin remained in a care facility, where she was finally getting the help she needed. Even my grandfather, once a staunch ally of my parents, had turned his back on them. It all felt surreal, like I was finally reaching the end of a long and painful chapter. As for my husband and me, our new life abroad was just beginning. We had started our IVF journey, focusing on building the future we'd always wanted. For the first time in a long while, the chaos was behind us, and we could look forward with hope instead of fear. Life was finally starting to look up, and I knew we had made the right choice in leaving the past behind. Just when I thought the chaos had finally settled, life decided to throw one last curveball. My sperm donor, after cutting ties with my egg donor, made a desperate attempt to worm his way back into my grandfather's favor. He begged and pleaded, trying to convince him to let him back into the family. But it was too late. My grandfather had already made up his mind. He arranged for my twin to stay in long-term care and made plans to move closer to my aunt, leaving the family home behind. As for my sperm donor, he was left entirely on his own, with no one left to manipulate or exploit. The final blow came when my sperm donor discovered that my egg donor was still up to her old tricks. She had continued using my name to apply for rental properties and open fraudulent credit lines. His anger was palpable, but it didn't change a thing. My grandfather had already severed ties with both of them, and my egg donor was now facing not only criminal charges for attacking the police, but also a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Their world was crumbling around them, and for the first time, they had no one to blame but themselves. For me, this brought an unexpected sense of relief. I was no longer part of their drama, no longer caught in their toxic web. They were finally dealing with the fallout of their own choices, and I was thousands of miles away from it all. Meanwhile, my husband and I were busy building the life we had always dreamed of. We had purchased a beautiful home in our new country, a place that felt safe and peaceful, a place where we could finally breathe. Our IVF journey was progressing smoothly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I found myself looking forward without the weight of the past holding me back. I still get occasional updates from my aunt, but I've chosen to redirect my energy entirely toward my own happiness. My biological parents, my twin, and even my in-laws had revealed their true colors long ago, and I've made peace with the fact that I'll never have the family I once wished for. And that's okay, because now I have my husband, the possibility of children, and a fresh start in a place where we can thrive. That, I've come to realize, is more than enough.